Hello, everyone, and welcome to the US and China space rivalry. What caused it? My name is Rebecca Schembri. I'm a social scientist and space diplomat graduate of Harvard University. And it's going. This presentation identifies the defining moments in China's space program from 1949 to the current day, and the effect that American diplomatic policy had on China's progress. Before we get started, could someone please speak up and tell me what your attitude towards China is? Ron, if you could choose someone, or if someone could raise their hand or just jump in. Let's hear from a couple people. What is your attitude towards China?
Brady, since you have a video on, you want to take a run at that?
Sure, happy to. I actually teach a lot of students from China. So I see it as a positive place that I think in the media circles seems to want to continue to generate conflict with them.
Yeah, totally agree, Brady. Anyone else?
Martin here.
Yes, go ahead.
Skeptical of their domestic situation and cautiously optimistic or hopeful of their international position.
Yes, agree. It's a sensitive topic. Someone else? Someone else?
Yes, I would. Irving Tiffany here.
Hi,
I would agree with what was just said. Skeptical about their domestic situation,
yeah.
Human rights, and very cautiously hopeful about the international situation.
Yes, yes. Who else? I see three people have their hands, two people have their hands up, and then we'll close comments. Go ahead.
And I worked for NASA for 40 years.
Okay.
And so pretty much everything having to do with China and space was off limits. So I kind of have natural baked in skepticism. But I am very interested in what they've been able to accomplish pretty much in isolation from the rest of the technology that we weren't allowed to share with them after all these years.
Yes, yes. And our final person with their hands up?
I would say brilliant, hardworking. I used to have Chinese classmates, though not in space, in economics.
Mm-hmm.
At the PhD programs, the ones who got to the US were the brilliant, most hardworking people I ever met, probably. You know, like what we learn at PhD, they already knew from master's degrees from China. Though I know that in space there is a rivalry, and basically any movie you watch, it's basically a race between countries. And even when you look at the US, the perception in space is that we want to collaborate as long as it's not with China or Russia, you know? So I look forward to your session.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a lot of culture in America that is skeptical of China. We heard a lot of that, but we also heard that there is some interest in China and some friendship towards China. So I think it's fair to say that in America, we have mixed feelings, especially, well, probably even government officials all the way down to non-government and the public sector. It was interesting to hear from our NASA representative that that is the professional culture at NASA is to not work with China. So you may say that China is untrustworthy, and that China lies and steals, and that China has bad morals, and that China is dangerous, and that China is communist, and that communism is bad, and that China is bad, and that China is our enemy, and that China must be stopped. And I'm not here today to take away any of that fear. Your fear is valid. What I want to offer today are long-term benefits for American safety and American security and American prosperity and American sustainability. And if you're not American, or if you don't live in America, these ideas will also apply to you, because I'm giving global insights today for how we can achieve a heightened space diplomacy. So on our agenda today is we'll hear from some pieces of what experts have to say about the United States and China relationship as far as diplomacy goes, and why we've had so many failures in diplomacy with China. And then we'll also look at what our space experts have to say, American space experts and international space experts. Then we'll jump into a quick history of China's space program, and we'll parallel the major milestones in China's space program history with American diplomatic policy, and we'll see how one affected the other. Then we'll get into an analysis of what happened, why it happened, and what it means for all of us. And finally, I'll give some recommendations. As a space diplomat, it's my job to give recommendations. So I'll be giving some policy recommendations or some general recommendations for what we can do about this situation. And in the end, I would like everyone who wants to participate to please be a part of this presentation. We'll have a full half hour at the end of my slides, so that everyone who wants to talk about this will hopefully have a chance. Ron is moderating this talk, and you can put your questions into the chat and he'll make sure that we get to them, or you just save your question for the end and then you can raise your hand when it's time. Just a side note, all of the cartoons that you're about to see, they're all considered Chinese propaganda, and I hope you enjoy them because they're very persuasive and they're very fun and beautiful, especially if you love all things space. So as I mentioned, please chat your comments. Feel free to use the chat. I won't see the chat, but Ron will see what you're talking about. So feel free to participate and save your questions till the end. A little bit about me. I have an academic background from Harvard University. Today I'm presenting my findings from my undergraduate degree in international relations and space law and policy, and also my findings from part of my master's degree. I'm currently a candidate at Harvard University in international relations and in space diplomacy. So let's hear what our experts have to say about what is going on between the US and China. We have 7 experts that we'll be hearing a little bit from each of them. First, we'll start out with a non-space historian, and then we'll look at a couple of American space policy analysts. Then we'll get into 3 international and independent space program scholars, and then we'll look at a Chinese-American biographer, and we'll consider what all 7 of these experts have to say before drawing a takeaway. So first, our US and China historian is Dong Wang. She wrote this book. It's a culmination of her very extensive and very authoritative research on the history of the US and China from the 18th century to the present. And what she had to say after she finished her research was that America has humiliated China for 150 years. And that according to American political culture, China will never become a superpower because China is unstable and weak. This is what she says that is the sentiment in America. And that there is a deep history of exploitation of China on behalf of the European countries and the United States. And that during the mid-1800s all the way into the mid-1900s, these imperialistic countries sought out to benefit from China in unequal trade treaties, and they forced China's hand in many ways, and China experienced a loss of sovereignty. During this time, the United States coerced diplomacy within China's borders, and the United States coerced capitalist ideals within the Chinese dynasty, and the United States coerced a regime change and was successful in overthrowing the Chinese dynasty at the turn of the 20th century. And then the United States came in and coerced nationalism and democracy within China's borders. And then the United States coerced Western religion with Christianity within China's borders. And the US coerced Western morality within China's borders. And in America, at that same time, under those unequal trade treaties, Chinese workers were allowed to come to America in the late 1800s. But the US government formed exclusionary laws against these workers, and these workers were basically used and abused to build United States infrastructure. And there was widespread legalized racial discrimination because the Chinese people living in America were denied human and legal rights. They could not bring wives. They couldn't have women from China. They couldn't enter into contracts or land ownership, and they had little legal recourse. And this at times even led to massacres of Chinese people and to racial violence, to an overall culture of discrimination against Chinese people, and to even targeted fires of entire neighborhoods where Chinatowns were burnt to the ground. China calls this its century of humiliation from 1839 to 1949. It's when China lost parts of its sovereignty and its right to self-determine because other countries, especially the United States and the European countries, took advantage of China and wanted to prosper at China's detriment. When we look at what American space analysts say, we see that back in 2005, we have a history of congressional analysts and military analysts saying that officials simply don't believe that China could ever rival the United States. And this is Marcia Clark. She's a nonpartisan congressional analyst. She's very successful and very well versed. And she reported at this time that the United States officials laugh at space program rivalry with China, and that United States officials refused to believe that China could surpass American supremacy in space technology. And when we look at our military analyst who reported on behalf of his findings, he reported that China would not surpass American supremacy for decades to come. Basically, it was, again, the culture in America that China was nothing. When we looked at our international space experts, however, we saw a different story. This is Brian Harvey. He's the authoritative scholar on the Chinese space program. And what he says is that many in the Western media who ought to know better responded to Chinese space developments with a mixture of puzzlement, patronizing put-downs, and dismissal, that there remains an extraordinary reluctance to concede to the Chinese the credit of having created, designed, and built their own equipment, that the West often forgets how China pioneered so many things, from medicine to mathematics. And when we look at our Indian scholar, this is the Indian expert on the Chinese space program, he reported that the Chinese built the first rockets in the Dark Ages, and that ancient Chinese astronomers were famous for their calculations of the cosmos, and that the Chinese space program is unbreakable, and that it deserves great respect. And we even have a Russian scholar who is an expert in the Chinese space program. She says, from her point of view, that China wanted equal international respect, that China built a world-class space program, and that America consistently undervalued China's space program. So our takeaway from looking at these first initial 6 experts, we'll get to our biographer in a minute, is that the main reason China made its space program a national priority is because it wanted sovereignty and safety and due respect. So let's look now at the history of the Chinese space program. First, we had that century of humiliation, and then when the century of humiliation ended in 1949, we see the Chinese space program rising to prominence. So let's look at what happened. In the 1950s, we have some initial defining moments, and perhaps the greatest defining moment in the history of China's space program is the story of Dr. Xian Shuishen. Dr. Xian was born in China, and he came to America under a full scholarship to MIT. He was very good at mathematics. He was pretty much a genius in mathematics, and MIT recruited him. And he came to America in his early 20s, and he became a rocket scientist, one of the best rocket scientists of the era. And Caltech recruited him also when Caltech heard of his talent. And Caltech recruited him for a PhD in aerodynamics, and both institutions offered Dr. Xian tenure at their institutions. And he came to have a very successful career, and he is one of the major players that built the American space program. He worked with Dr. Theodore von Karman. If you've heard of the Karman line, that's who he worked with. But his memory is basically erased from American space history because of the politics involved. So in 1949, the United States recruited Dr. Xian as a US colonel in the Manhattan Project, and Dr. Xian helped America win World War II by creating the atomic bomb. And when he came back, when the war was over, Dr. Xian co-founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he was one of the directors at JPL. And then he also applied for American citizenship after having been in America for almost 2 decades. America was his country, and America was where he wanted to live. But in 1949, that same year, the Chinese Communist Party came to power in China. And we had a senator in America named Senator McCarthy, and he had his personal political campaign was to campaign for democracy within China's borders. And he did everything he could to stop communism from taking power. But when the Chinese Communist Party won the civil war between nationalism and communism, the People's Republic of China took power, and Senator McCarthy instilled a panic in America, and he told Americans that every person of Chinese origin was a threat to America and was a potential spy. And Dr. Xian Shuishen fell victim to this Red Scare, along with hundreds of Chinese scientists. And Dr. Xian was imprisoned, and he was fired, and he was disgraced, and there was no evidence showing that he was a communist sympathizer, much less a communist spy. And this is a little movie about what happened. It's probably a 3-star movie, but he did say that he would never return to America once he was deported after 5 years of imprisonment. Dr. Xian is also the subject of a very good biography. This is our 7th expert. Her name is Iris Chang, and she wrote that the story of Xian Shuishen, the brilliant, enigmatic, and Chinese-born scientist who helped pioneer the American space age, when rejected by the nation he sought to adopt as his own, he became the undisputed father of the Chinese missile program. The Red Scare did not make America stronger. It made China stronger, because Dr. Xian Shuishen was returned to China along with hundreds of other qualified space scientists. Directly after that, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and this is another defining moment in the history of the rise of the Chinese space program, because when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite to space, it startled the whole world. And there was a security threat space race that began when the American government freaked out and established NASA so that we could also compare with the Soviets and compete with and exceed Soviet technology. And this is when we start seeing the beginnings of the Outer Space Treaty at the United Nations, because there was a great fear during the Cold War that space would now become weaponized with this technology. So China and the United States respectively made space technology a national priority at this point. And the leader of China, Mao Zedong, he announced to his people, he says, "We too shall build artificial satellites." And Mao Zedong put Dr. Shen, the persecuted scientist, the initiator of the American space program. He puts him in charge of China's space program. And Mao did something very smart. In order to keep the space program alive, he hid it under the auspices of the Chinese military. Because any of you who are engineers or who understand space technology, it all doubles, it's all dual use for military. But in America, we don't say that NASA is for the military. We say that NASA is an agency for, scientific exploration. But in China, they did it differently, and they hid their space program under the Chinese military, and that kept the space program immune from any political upheavals. Whereas in America, NASA can ebb and flow depending on who's in the current administration. That didn't happen in China. And they made space a national priority because also of the space race that was happening between the US and the Soviets. So in the 1960s, we have some defining moments as well. The biggest sentiment is that there was little to no diplomacy between the US and China. During this time, we had the remnants of the McCarthy era still. It was culture to hate China, to fear China, to want to destroy China. And we had the Vietnam War, where China and the United States were on opposite sides of the ideological battle in Vietnam. So it was a very tense time. And China, as our NASA audience member said, China developed independently of the US. There was no diplomacy, basically. And so everyone's aspiring to human spaceflight at this time. And this is just a few years after Sputnik was launched by the Soviets. So 5 years later, America succeeds in sending humans to space, and China succeeds in sending these little doggies to space. But American supremacy, the idea of the space race with the Soviets, that America must be the global leader, that idea of American supremacy, it threatened China, and it made China try harder, because China knew that America was always going to stifle China, that America did not accept China the way it was. So in the 70s, we see some defining moments here. We found a memo of Zhou Enlai. He was one of the leaders of China. He confessed in a diplomatic meeting with Henry Kissinger of the United States. He confessed that China was fearful of the advancements in technology that were happening, and that was why China was developing its technology. And here I quote, "Some people," says the leader of China, "have asked us, since we advocate the complete prohibition and thorough destruction of nuclear weapons, why as China, we are testing nuclear weapons. We must say very frankly that we do so to break the nuclear monopoly and to fight against the nuclear blackmail of certain great powers." So China admits that it's freaked out also from what's happening, and that China is scurrying to keep up. So right after that, we have a regime change in China, and this was a huge moment for China, because China's new leader decided that the Chinese space program would not only be for military use, it would also have social and economic value. And this program, these rules are still in place today. And it was at this point in the mid-70s that China began to sell space services to the world, and China began to seek how to monetize its space program and how to meet civilian and domestic needs. So here, on China's side, we see this desire to renew diplomacy, especially with the United States. And so in the 1980s, we see China continues this quest for international diplomacy, and China joined the ITU and the International Astronautical Federation and the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and the Outer Space Treaty. Joining these institutions gave China union rights for satellite launches. It also gave China credibility, and it gave China an international presence and, again, credibility as a country that upholds the peaceful uses of outer space. And then in 1984, we have this beautiful breakthrough where China received President Reagan from America in Beijing. And with the red Chinese flag flying behind him, Reagan stood at attention while a band played the Star-Spangled Banner, and Chinese artillery gave him a rare 21-gun salute. So it was at this point that we have this breakthrough, because there's a new American president, and they were still in a type of Cold War with the Soviets/Russians. So China and the US at this meeting, they agreed to work on nuclear power together. It was a huge milestone in Sino-American diplomacy, but it was short-lived. And it's always been short-lived because of the difference in opinions. In the 1970s and 1980s, the US repeatedly suspended and revoked Chinese satellite missions to force China to comply with US norms. So what this means is that China was trying to sell its space, monetize its space program, and the US was stopping China from doing that because China did not have the same ethics, especially in human rights. And so because the US is a democracy, the American public could pressure our decision makers to not work with China and to stifle China. And so we see that there's this tug of war over ethics between China and America, and it caused us to have a failed space diplomacy. But these coerced American ethics only made China stronger. They didn't make America stronger, because China became even more determined to overcome. So in the 1990s, we see that the Chinese sold a seat to an American company wanting to launch a satellite to space. And that rocket, that Chinese rocket, crashed. And when it crashed, the American people tried to go and recover, the American company tried to go and recover the wreckage, and missing from the wreckage were the chips from the satellites. And so it caused a huge rift in diplomacy with China, because the United States accused China at that point of stealing American data. So then the US banned China from the International Space Station. And this was a huge blow for China, because China lost the opportunity to partner on the ISS with partners such as Russia, Canada, Japan, the UK, and the ESA countries. And then we start seeing another political witch hunt emerging. And I'm going to show you three gentlemen who also descended from the McCarthy era, and they just did not like China. And they accused China of stealing the same technology that China had created when the scientists were here a few decades earlier. And also China had partnered with the Soviets after the US rejected China back in the 50s, and I believe it was the 50s, maybe into the 60s, but China partnered with the Soviets for space technology. And so this statement simply doesn't have basis, and it was a partisan statement. So US Representative Cox, he accused China of using, in a systemic way, fair means and foul, neutral scientific conferences, licensing arrangements, dual-use military civilian technologies, and straightforward spying to ferret out information on nuclear technology, computers, rockets, submarines, and atomic bombs for decades. And this can be construed as racism. So the US partisanship actually made China stronger. It divided America, and it divided our chance at diplomacy with China. In the 2000s, though, China is still at the heels of America, and China achieves finally human spaceflight. So China is coming up slowly but surely, even though the US has rejected China. And however, just a few years after China achieves human spaceflight, another congressman created a bill that banned Chinese collaboration with NASA. This is Representative Wolf, and he believed that China was spying on us. And so he passed this amendment, which is still in place today. And it bans China from collaborating with NASA. And independent scholars have reported that this Wolf Amendment ultimately undermined an international culture of multilateralism in space by sowing distrust between the major space powers. You know the phrase, keep your enemies close, keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. This was the opposite of that. This was pushing away someone who these representatives considered our enemy. And then we see blatant racism in Congress. Representative Culberson, as reported by NASA Administrator Charles Bolden, this representative did not want any made in China items on the International Space Station. He just didn't like China and wanted to discriminate against China. And these are little blips where we could have easily, you know, if you have some item you're using on the space station that clearly can't be used for spying, those are just little opportunities for diplomacy to at least honor China and recognize China. But they were 100% against China. Well, I can't say 100%, but I can say that they were against China, and they said that they did not want any made in China items because they didn't like China. So this US discrimination, however, it only made China stronger, and China throughout all these years just kept going and going and going. And China's very disciplined in that sense, in that China seems to be very slow and steady. They're very macro. They're like, we'll go 100 years by 100 years. Or if any of you have seen the movie, The Wandering Earth, it's basically a 2,500 year plan to move Earth to the back of the solar system because the sun is about to turn into a supernova. So the idea is that China's very macro and it's very patient. And so this US discrimination, it didn't make America any stronger. In fact, it made China stronger. And then we have this tipping point when NASA announces the Artemis program, and this is humanity's return to the moon, and everyone is allowed to return to the moon except China, because China by congressional law is excluded from the Artemis program. So China cannot sign the Artemis Accords, and China is excluded from this. This is an exclusionary act, just as the acts in the late 1800s excluded China from having Chinese people from having rights. This is a type of racism and a type of discrimination. And so what we see here is that Artemis made China stronger, because China now at this point is in a panic to land on the moon quickly. Because once America lands on the moon and forms dominance in cislunar orbit, it'll serve as a type of funnel where access to the moon, and obviously to deep space, if you're launching from the moon to deep space, access will be blocked unless you go through those American channels. And likewise, if China gets there first and dominates cislunar orbit, something similar could happen. So now we're in a full-on dangerous space rivalry because of the decisions we've made over the past 150 years. So now the US administration is like, wow, out of nowhere, this happened. And now make no mistake about it, we're in a space race today, suddenly, just as we were in the 1960s. And the stakes are even higher. And then in 2020, bam, China launches secretly to Mars, appears on Mars. Then the next year, China publishes its plan for a moon base to match Artemis. And Russia had rejected the Artemis Accords because Russia said that the Artemis Accords were very American-centric, because as our last speaker was saying, Michelle Hanlon, that the Artemis Accords allow for a heritage clause in which we will memorialize and secure the Apollo mission trophies. So those trophies are not in Russia's best interest, because Russia, former Soviet Union, lost that space race. So Russia has said that the Artemis was too American-centric. It was celebrating the Apollo era, and it's basically an American-led effort. So Russia instead partners with China, and this is a strong partnership. Now that, we're used to Russia partnering with us on the ISS, and now Russia's on the other side. And then they did something even bigger, which they're seeking diplomacy with other nations. So I have heard chatter in Europe, and maybe some of you know of this, that some European countries are considering joining the Chinese side. And also with the Wolf Amendment, anyone who works with China is not allowed to work with America, and anyone who works with America is not allowed to work with China. So countries have to choose which country they want to partner with. and China offers lower prices. Right after that, the Chinese, they've got their space station now. They've reached a point where they're mirroring and directly competing with the United States and US efforts. So let's recap how and why this rivalry happened. In 1950, Schembri was disgraced by America, along with many other Chinese-born scientists. When they were sent back home, it emboldened China. Then in the 50s through the 60s and the 1990s, we see an increase in global nuclear technology, in Soviet satellite technology, in American human spaceflight technology, and in American military space technology. These technologies threatened China because they were coupled with the American shadow over Chinese. Had America always honored and respected and recognized China, perhaps China wouldn't have tried so hard. But if America was going to push China down and take away China's sovereignty little by little, these technologies severely threatened China. And then we see in the 1990s to the 2010s, full-on exclusionary laws again. America bans China from the space station. This made China not be able to take part in what other countries were doing. And then America banned all Chinese space collaboration with NASA. So this excluded China. Then we have the breaking point. The NASA Artemis mission will stop Chinese access to space. So here's what the rivalry means. China wants to collaborate. NASA will not partner with China. China must find other partnerships. NASA complains that China and Russia are partnering against the US. China claims that the US is smearing China and ignoring the facts. NASA now wants to territorialize the moon or establish a permanent human presence on the South Pole of the moon. China says this is illegal. According to international law, you cannot take land that, even if you say it's for science, you can't take this land permanently because this is an enclosure movement. You are taking advantage of a global commons. And so NASA says, well, we're going to bypass that because we're going to invite other countries, but not China. So now China is panicked and says we must hurry before the US blocks our access to the moon. And now NASA is accusing China of trying to steal the moon. And now the American Space Force is mobilized. This is true diplomacy. This is true failure of diplomacy. America is pushing China to space militarization. In conclusion, a wise person once said that unjust peace is far better than righteous war. Excluding China from space collaboration, it did not make America stronger. Every exclusionary act made China stronger. And China simply seeks equality and safety. Had America depolarized international relations with China and sought diplomatic peace, even if it was unjust, and acknowledged that China was doing its best, and ceded recognition whenever possible, China may have lacked the motivation to become a US space rival. We could have pursued peaceful purposes of outer space. Instead, United States policy built up tensions teetering on a righteous war that Americans will pay for or may pay for with lives, infrastructure, and generational wealth. We must renew diplomacy with China. We must apologize for the things we've done, and we must recognize that China deserves to be an equal. Our children's children, and all those who dream not only to become astronauts and space travelers, but who deserve a fair chance at lives of peace, prosperity, and self-determination, are depending on us to leave them a better world. Thank you for listening. I have a question for you, and please ask your questions. My question to you, please raise your hand if you'd like to answer, is what steps can America take for space diplomacy with China? So what steps can America take for space diplomacy with China? Tiffany. Oh, sorry, Irving. Excuse me.
Well, I was really preparing to ask a question about the history that you covered. You did not, as I recall, mention the Korean War at all. And I grew up in that environment with a brother that fought in that war, but I still don't understand it. Other than China was in the background. So can you shed any light on that?
Yes, I know that it was the Korean War and the Vietnam War. They were both very important for a failure in diplomatic relations with China. Unfortunately, my studies during this semester that I gathered this information, I didn't go in depth on the Korean War. So is there someone here in the audience that maybe is a veteran or someone who understands the politics of the Korean War could brief us quickly in a couple sentences on what happened there?
I mean, I understand that the Korean War technically is not over, that armistice was never agreed to.
Yeah, go ahead. Who was someone trying to break in? Brady?
Oh, sorry. I could enlighten just slightly from
Thank you.
my understandings.
Thank you.
The longstanding history of, kind of America playing a game of sticking our nose into particularly Eastern Asian countries. And so playing out throughout World War II was the conflict between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. And basically what it was a pretty much a small group of pro-democracy, pro-democratic China in the US government. So they were very supportive of Chiang Kai-shek. So pretty much how, like when Japan was invading China through the course of the World War II, Mao was basically trying to defend against the Japanese, whereas Chiang Kai-shek was much more focused on undermining Mao's growing communism movement, which then kind of sets up for the conflict between what is now Taiwan and China. At the same time, Korea being a hotbed for what was a Japanese colony and a major Japanese presence. The original Kim family, I forget the grandfather's name, but he was a communist. And so he basically was gaining support from Mao. And so in the kind of process of World War II ending, you essentially have the Kim family building power within Korea by pushing out the Japanese and developing a relationship with Mao's communist government. And so, fast forward, the Kim family wants to unite all of Korea, whereas there's another party playing out, which was the so-called pro-democracy side within Korea, which then kind of builds off of that existing conflict with Chiang Kai-shek and Mao. Pretty much at that moment, the United States, as Rebecca said, dropped a pretty major ball at working with particularly Mao and the communist government, who wanted to work with the United States. And then everything else is history.
Thank you, Brady, and thank you, Irving. Yeah, so we see more failure to establish diplomacy. What other questions do we have?
Martin here.
Hi, Martin. Hi, Martin.
Hi. Just to give like the U.S. perspective on the Korean War, it was part of the same strategy of the U.S. strategy against the Soviet Union, which was containment. So the idea was that like Kim Il Sung was a client of China, and so the whole objective was, the 38th parallel was crossed, and so it was to check the spread of communism. That was the given. It was also, we have to look at it was a United Nations police action technically. So I think it was the only war that was never declared and never brought to a close. Just as
Wow.
background.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Martina.
Hi, Rebecca. It's very thought-provoking conversation and also a great overview on the history and the direction we are heading. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the topic of ethics and what kind of subtopics belong there. One of them that stands up to me is human genetical engineering. And my best guess would be that once someone starts doing it, other countries will have a lower barrier to start doing it too. And I would not be surprised if somebody like Russia or China were the leaders in genetical engineering to optimize humans for space. But can you comment along these lines? Thank you.
So you're not going to like my answer, Martina, because if you study international politics, you learn that the only time one country should intervene with another country is when there's a genocide occurring or ethnic cleansing occurring or crimes against humanity. Up until those, therefore, responsibility to protect. And as a world, we have agreed that we will allow each nation to have its own sovereignty and to choose it, make its own decisions. And so that would have to be something that could go through the UN, but the UN is so slow. But ultimately, it comes down to, unless there's widespread, essentially murder of many, many human lives, we don't get involved. And so what you're bringing up with these are ethical questions, and I think maybe I'd be curious what you think we can do. I mean, maybe the more that we lead by example and we establish friendships and diplomacy, we can sway the countries. Like, we do use soft power to sway. In fact, NASA is a form of soft power. It's according to Administrator Bolton, it's the #2 form of soft power in America is NASA. So it's not an easy answer, Martina. We really have to let countries have their own sovereignty. Otherwise, we're just bullying everyone into doing what we want them to do. So, and tragic, what you're saying, very, very, lots of ethical concerns there. And it's just from an international politics standpoint, international relations, we're really not supposed to get involved. We're supposed to let people self-determine. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, and I know this is like challenging topic. I'm also curious, like, can you think of any other topics that would belong under the ethical topic? Is it just the genetical engineering and human rights, or is it also something else that you can think of?
Well, I mean, just communism versus democracy. That's a huge ethical battle, you know, and then it's also, should a country be allowed to self-determine if what they're determining is to the detriment of a lot of people? At what point do we intervene? So these are ethics. So I think that's the biggest one is, can we accept that there is a communist country in the world? And people say, well, communism seeks to dominate the whole world. Well, but doesn't democracy also seek to dominate the whole world? Like, where do we draw the line? And do we allow I wish we had, is Nick Nielsen here? Because Nick is our ethicist and he would probably have some good stuff to say about this, but it really does come down to what we decide to do as a human society, as a civilization, and how we work together to establish that diplomacy. A lot of it, Martina, comes down to being friends with people and trying to listen to them and help them reach their goals without forcing them to do what you want. It's relationships. It's the long road. Diplomacy is the long road. It might take generations to get what we want. Other questions?
Hey, Rebecca, Terry, sorry,
Hi,
I
Terry.
get on video, but
That's
yeah.
okay. I already saw you. You look good.
Cheers, you're awesome. This is it's a timely talking, right? I mean, we're at this. I feel like it's a fulcrum. All right, I feel like we can go either way, and it could not be good either way. And when you mention ethics in space to me don't mean the same as they do down here. There is no sovereignty in space. That's why someone has to crack the whip. And I said it the other day, I think you or someone commented it. We need to get a bit heavy-handed about how we handle a definition of sovereignty. The UN has to be, in my opinion, they have to be more forceful. And I don't know how we convince UNUSA or whomever to do that. It's definitely disconcerting. I haven't felt this kind of freaky about it in a while until we really started thinking about it, and then paying attention to what you're doing and others. I don't know. I'm just nervous. That's all. There you are. There's my
Thank you, Terry. I agree. I think we are on the road to militarization and to weaponization. And if you have any friends in the Space Force, they might be able to confide in you and tell you, I know a lot of it's classified, but maybe it's already happening. I know that we are prepared to defend ourselves against China. But Terry, the thing is that the UN has no authority to enforce. The UN is basically all of our New Year's resolutions that we're like, I vow to treat my neighbors nicely and to get along with everyone, and we'll only use space for peaceful purposes. And then 3 weeks after your New Year's resolution, you're already smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol and cussing because that was what you're giving up.
Sorry, I'm laughing out loud. Or you just fired off your ASAT and you're like, oh, look at that. Oh.
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. So the only way that the UN could enforce it is if the nations gave the UN power to do that. But most democratic nations won't give the UN power. Well, a lot of nations won't, because that's how we could lose our democracy, is if there was a centralized government. So that's a hot button. Thank you for commenting. That reminded me of what Nick was saying, that like you could talk about ethics forever. You do need this codified norms and then the force behind it, because otherwise none of us will hold ourselves accountable. Basically, we all just aspire to do well, but in the end, we want to eat that bag of potato chips, and we want to lay on the couch, and we don't want to, do all the things that would make us be our best humans. You lose that when it comes down to the line. So I see we have, thank you, Terry, for your comment, and thank you, Martina, for your comment. We have 2 more questions. So Paul and then Charlie. Hi, Paul.
Hi, but mine is not more a question than more than a comment of what you have presented. That was a wonderful presentation, Becca. I loved it. And the reason why I'm here in this particular room is because, of course, now in Africa, for everyone's introduction, I'm in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm a Kenyan, and Africa has had a heavy economic colonization in Africa. As we are speaking today, I didn't actually know that there was going to be a discussion about China and the US in regards to space astronomy. I'm actually drawing a suit against Chinese government because of the heavy, and what they do is that the economic prowess of China, once they hit the country, today we just got a very corrupt leak. It is right now in the media. We have a breaking news here of a shady dealing between them and the railway construction line in Nairobi, here in Kenya. So by extension, I would say this: NASA has not collaborated greatly, especially with African countries. Chinese came along and in their Tiangong space station are actually collaborating with Kenya. For the first time, an African country will be collaborating with the Chinese in their space station. But the question that we, the public, are asking ourselves is, to what end, or to what other economic colonization upon our country? It's a good deal, yes, but we don't know the after effects of that kind of a collaboration, because there are always things that we get to learn after the deals have been signed. China's influence in Africa, mega infrastructure, has really happened here in this continent. So I would suggest that NASA's lack of collaboration with other countries, by the way, when I say collaboration with other countries,
Did we lose Paul?
Yeah,
he froze here.
Okay, so I'm going to recap what he said. He said NASA doesn't collaborate with China. China is again going to other countries to establish this power. And so because there is a security threat. So Paul is from Nairobi, Africa, and he says that the Chinese now have space agencies and space technology, space infrastructure in Africa. And it's wonderful for Africa, but he's also wondering what's the end, what's the obligation going to be in the end? And this is kind of just supports what we're talking about today, in that America making China feel so threatened. Now China is dominating so much more and is branching out. And eventually we'll get to a point where, I mean, China can have many other countries or other continents, and then there'll be an unequal, like this is a threat. This is a threat to America. And it's kind of like we made our own bed. So I think we should definitely try to be involved. Thank you, Paul. Charlie, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Rebecca.
Hi.
This is kind of a question to the group in general here. So the company I work for, we sell marketing software. And a handful of years ago, we cut ties with our engineering group. We had one team that was based in Beijing. We basically just chopped off that limb. And it was a direct result of things that were happening politically. So my question to the group is, and this is with respect to your overarching question, Rebecca, regarding what can be done to help improve relations between America and China. Well, it's sort of a look at, this is a group of engineers or people who work in engineering disciplines. So I'm wondering to the group, have other companies chopped off relations with teams of engineers or other support resources that are based in China? And if so, do you think that continues to have an impact or a perceived impact? I mean, perception is very often truth these days, on our relationship in the space domain with China. You see what I'm getting at there?
Yes, I do. Do any of you, are your companies boycotting China, or are you, I know we heard from NASA where they haven't been able to work with China for a very long time, but are any of you boycotting China, and what do you think that's going to cause?
And even if it's not something that everybody has a direct answer for, just something to consider, like what is your company's stance on China?
This is also timely. I had a water project that I did in Nepal, and a Chinese manufacturer of the material that we needed literally held us out, took our money from us, and didn't provide us, the service or the materials per specifications that we wanted. And, maybe it's a little too personal, but I have to say, if that's going to happen, I'm certainly not going to go do business in China ever again.
Yeah.
So, interesting thought.
Yeah. And you have all the right to do that, Terry. And the problem is that it just keeps escalating. And so in the end, like your children, your children's children, they're going to be like, oh no, it's just our rule. We just don't deal with China. And so then we never it becomes permanent. Thank you, Terry. Elizabeth, the last question, I think, and then we're on a 15-minute break.
Oh, I just put it in the chat. I think it's important that we be careful about what words we use. You mentioned the word propaganda regarding the cartoon-like illustrations of the Chinese kids and rockets, but you'd also have to classify, I put a NASA webpage up of kids playing with rockets also. How is that not propaganda if you're going to use that word for it? Or is it really just public relations and outreach? I mean, we got to be careful about what we label as propaganda and what we label as advertising and outreach.
Yes, it's actually, and so in China, they call it publicity posters. And
Yeah.
so I use the word propaganda because I knew you all would recognize that word, but I wasn't completely comfortable using it because it is derogatory. And also, you know, as I studied China, Elizabeth, you're exactly right. Like propaganda is just marketing. It's just marketing. And you could strongly argue that maybe not our government, but yes, NASA does very much like win our hearts with its pictures, and then also and advertisements, and then also we have Hollywood. Hollywood forms our political culture in many ways, and that's the American propaganda that is happening. And you can, if you had political aspirations and you wanted to push an agenda, you can push it through Hollywood and the whole American public will be exposed to it. So I saw that they're just doing things a little differently from us, but we have our human rights violations and we have our political problems, and we also have our version of propaganda. So okay, we're on a break. If anyone wants to stay and chat, that's okay. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Ron. Anything you want to say? Thanks for moderating.
Oh, nothing to add. Great presentation. Really interesting. There's so much to get in depth with, and you know, really, it's sad to see. Like, I think I agree that like the militarization of space, and you know, I think we just so much need that cooperation. And I don't know, maybe we'll get there. I think it'll be a really different landscape in 10 years. I just read an article this morning from Jeff Kluger in Time talking about saying that China was building a replica of SpaceX's Starship so that they'll be able, the Chinese National Space Administration released a drawing or an image of it, and they almost always come through when they release a drawing that, you know, if they have something like spaceship with a capability to take that Starship that much payload to orbit, you know, it could be very, very different in the ways to get to space.
Yeah. Yes. And China works in secret until, like you say, they publish something and then they do it. Like China is not like us where we scrub missions all the time. Like China will not announce until they're ready, and then they do it. And they like China slow and steady wins the race. Like if there's the rabbit and what was it? The turtle and the hare. And so the hare was running really fast. The rabbit was running so fast and beating the turtle, but then the rabbit took a nap up by the finish line, and then the turtle just kept walking and kept doing it. And that's China's plan. So yeah, I think you're right, Ron. Thanks everyone for being here. I hope if just one person leaves this presentation wanting to take baby steps towards diplomacy with China, that would be enough for me.
Cool.
Rebecca, it's Martin.
Hi.
You know, just to push back a little bit on.
Yeah, please do.
Just devil's advocate, whatever.
Yeah, we need all sides. We need to hear all sides.
Yeah, so maybe get other people to chime in. But what if we found a diplomatic path? Somehow, you know, the militaries agree that it wouldn't be risky in terms of dual use technology to, I don't know, do some kind of space station or do some kind of sun observing satellite. I don't know what it is. We find something to work on, and then we segregate it from the Taiwan situation, the human rights violations. I would add the 5G issue as a concern globally, the colonization, economic, however you want to say it, neo imperialism in across China, the Belt and Road, whatever. We choose our fight. We use it as a confidence building measure. What happens then? Again, I'm wearing the devil's advocate hat. What if that enables more domestic repression and getting Europe in debt to China? Not that the debt trap isn't happening within U.S. companies as well. So this is a balanced discussion, but if we enable bad impulses of China by, you know, as a reward the bad in China as through our engaged diplomacy, where we are trying to, see what I'm saying? What if the worst case scenario comes about based on our following our better angels of our nature?
Yeah, I mean,
So
it's true. Someone has to lay down their gun first, and the person that lays down their gun runs the risk of getting shot by the other person. So
Mhm.
where can we cede China and honor and recognize China, acknowledge them without putting ourselves in too much danger? And like, do we have to say no to everything? Are there some things we could collaborate on?
No, but I'm thinking the Chinese people. What if we are endangering the Chinese people or through our not appeasement, but rewarding, not coupling our diplomacy with domestic reforms
Yeah.
without us being culturally imperialist ourselves, as you definitely point out during the century of humiliation. We totally forget about that. That's totally not part of the discussion until you brought it up. So that's really, I thought that was the best part.
Everyone, and Martin did his studies in around almost 20 years ago, a couple decades ago, did a bunch of studies on China, and so he's something of an expert on China also. And I don't know, what do you think? Where should we start, Martin?
No, I think the 5G issue is the most fundamentally, because I mean, I think it's an unproven technology, and only Senator Blumenthal has been the lone voice against 5G, at least in the U.S. But my understanding is the technology has been driven in China, and it's been exported, to England, and all of our information media is coupled together. So I guess that's my biggest concern. That's through the pandemic and everything, we that's fallen off by the wayside. Like making sure 5G is safe, because like what does that lead to? Mind control? I don't know. I just think that's too high of a cost, and so that's the most. So if we can get an agreement on like 5G or telecommunication safety standards, that would be a small thing that could lead to big things. Then maybe, I mean, ultimately a Mars settlement communities, that would be the big step, like the vision of where we could lead, all countries could get together doing something like interplanetary. But I don't, it's a chicken and the egg question, where I'm not giving an answer here. I'm just worried. The unanswered question to me is, how do we influence in a positive way, stated US values, which we don't always follow ourselves, so that we're not rewarding totalitarianism, in China or in other countries, Iran, whatever, and in our own country. Because, and I thought I sent in a comment briefly that a matter of definition, the United States is not necessarily democracy. We're an oligarchy. China's an oligarchy. They're state capitalism. They're not necessarily communism, only in the Chinese Communist Party, but in practice, they're state capitalists. So those definitions, and agreeing like on who we are, and then go forward in the diplomatic process. But clearly more diplomacy, sure. Principled diplomacy.
Principle, yeah, I think it does come down to our attitude towards China, like even just being polite and watching our mouth and just being sensitive. It's going to be this took 150 years. Like, it's going to take some time, and I don't even know if it's possible, but thank you, Martin. So everyone, we're going to start our
I think there is another issue that we fail so many times. We expect, let's say, the Asian people to think like we do. And that creates a lack of understanding. That happens with negotiations. It happens with military, and it happens economically. We don't respect the same things, and so we don't expect the same results.
Thank you, Irving. Elizabeth?
Oh, just that, I remember watching a short clip about an American representative at the United Nations talking to a Chinese representative in a small working group. And he was, the American was saying, "Please, you have to handle your human rights issues in Mongolia." And the Chinese representative shot back, "You've got your own problems. You shouldn't be pointing the finger at us." I was like, yay, good for you.
Yeah, it's true.
So what I put in the chat is when we start teaching critical race theory, we might have a higher ground to speak from regarding China's human rights. And I don't really mean higher ground, but I mean, when we admit that we are capable of and have done and are doing those things we're criticizing them for, when you're pointing your finger, there's a bunch pointing back at you, that thing.
Yeah, like
if we don't be honest about ourselves, how would we expect a real diplomacy to be successful?
Yeah, exactly. We can be someone that they admire and they wish to, at least respect us, or if not partake in what we're doing because they do admire us, or we can pretend that we're much better than them and use that as an excuse to stifle them.
Yeah, exactly.
Advancement.
Yeah.
Okay, there are about 3 minutes till the next presentation, so let's take a quick bathroom break if anyone needs to break away real quick. Unless there's any last questions, I am here, but if not, let's take a real quick break and meet right back here in 3 minutes. Okay, we'll see you soon, everyone. See you in a few minutes.